In the autumn of 1983, the quiet logging community of Red Willow, Oregon lay hidden beneath a heavy veil of mist. Dense stands of spruce and hemlock rose like sentinels, their branches intertwined in shadowy silence. The Briggs family, Michael, Emma, and their young children Sarah and Tommy traveled along winding roads toward a lodge nestled deep within this forgotten wilderness. They'd sought isolation peace, a refuge from Michael's demanding city career. Instead, unknowingly, they had journeyed toward something far darker. As dusk began to fall, the family's old station wagon pushed deeper into the forest headlights, slicing through gathering darkness. Michael, with hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, glanced into the rearview mirror. Behind him, Emma's face was pale, eyes focused on something distant. She hadn't spoken for miles. He reached across, gently touching her hand, but she flinched. Outside, wind rustled through branches, and the air grew colder, infused with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Sarah stared through fogged windows, fingers drawing shapes in the condensation. Tommy slept beside her, oblivious to the tension that quietly filled the car. Emma finally broke the silence, voice thin, hesitant. "Did you notice anyone at the motel this morning?" Watching, Michael frowned. Watching, no. Why? Emma turned away, eyes scanning the woods as shadows lengthened. "Never mind. I thought..." Maybe it was nothing. Michael's chest tightened, her words hanging in the air like mist. In the distance, nestled within layers of pine and oak, the lodge loomed, a dark silhouette barely visible between the trees. Emma stiffened, her breath quickening imperceptibly. Deeper within the forest, unseen by the family, someone watched their approach. Eyes calm, patient, focused. The observer shifted quietly, fingers curling around a rusted axe handle as he stepped back into the shadows. The Briggs station wagon slowed, gravel crunching beneath worn tires as it turned onto a narrow dirt road barely noticeable from the main path. Trees crowded the edges, branches reaching out like twisted fingers, scraping gently against glass and metal. Michael let out a breath, forcing calm into his voice. Almost there. But Emma did not reply. She only stared straight ahead, gripping the seatbelt with white knuckles, silently praying they were alone. 3 days passed before anyone noticed the silence at the lodge. It was the quiet that alerted the local ranger, Jason Hendricks, during his routine patrol. He'd known the Briggs family was staying there, so when he saw the vehicle parked oddly close to the hunting trail, doors unlocked, windows slightly fogged with condensation, a sense of unease crept over him. Jason approached slowly, boots crunching softly through damp leaves and gravel. The forest was eerily still, broken only by occasional drops of moisture falling gently from the canopy. Reaching the car, he peered inside. The seats were empty except for a stuffed bear lying abandoned on the back seat floor, eyes glassy, one paw raised as if frozen mid-wave. He felt the hood. Cold. Jason scanned the ground, half expecting signs of struggle, footprints, something. But there was nothing. Just silence and the muffled rustle of leaves stirred by wind. He lifted his radio, calling it in, trying to keep his voice steady, even as dread coiled tightly in his gut. By evening, police and search crews converged at the trail. Flashlights sliced through growing darkness as radios crackled, voices tense. Sheriff Margaret Lane stood silently near the Briggs station wagon, her stern eyes narrowed thoughtfully. There was no blood, no broken glass, nothing to indicate violence, yet instinct told her this was far from ordinary. She knelt beside the car door, running fingers along the inside handle. Clean. Too clean. Margaret stood surveying the tree line, the tangled brush, the endless darkness spreading in every direction. Somewhere out there, a family had vanished, as if swallowed whole by the forest itself. The search continued long into the night, beams of light illuminating twisted roots and empty pathways. Voices called out again and again, echoing unanswered through the cold, damp woods. Margaret stood at the edge of the trail, eyes drifting back to the lonely vehicle as clouds parted briefly, revealing the moon's pale face. She knew these woods intimately, their hidden dangers, their quiet menace. But never before had a family vanished so completely. The lodge stood empty, untouched beds, neatly made as though awaiting guests who would never arrive. As Margaret turned to leave, her eyes caught movement deep within the trees, a flicker like someone stepping back into shadow. Heart pounding, she squinted into darkness, letting breath shallow. But nothing moved. Only silence returned, heavy and absolute, as though whatever watched from the darkness had decided not to reveal itself yet. In the days following the Briggs family's disappearance, Sheriff Margaret Lane's investigation settled into the grim routines of questioning locals and chasing half-whispered stories. The town of Red Willow was small secrets buried shallowly beneath polite smiles. Margaret knew someone here held answers, whether they realized it or not. At the edge of town stood Pine Ridge Motel, a dilapidated structure lost amid pines and ivy. Margaret stepped inside, the smell of damp carpet and stale cigarettes heavy in the air. Behind the desk, the clerk, an anxious woman named Valerie Shaw, fidgeted nervously, avoiding Margaret's steady gaze. "You checked in the Briggs family last Friday." Margaret's voice was calm, gentle, but insistent. Valerie nodded, her thin fingers twisting a motel pen. "Yes, they stayed one night, left very early next morning." "You notice anything unusual? Did they seem troubled?" Valerie hesitated, eyes darting briefly toward the door to the back office, then dropped to the counter. The wife seemed frightened. Margaret paused, studying Valerie carefully. Did she say why no? But Valerie's voice lowered instinctively. She kept glancing toward the window like she thought someone was outside. She asked about security, about locking the door. Didn't seem normal. The door behind Valerie opened sharply, interrupting their quiet exchange. A tall, sullen man with dark eyes entered, staring suspiciously at Margaret. Valerie's voice dropped immediately, becoming cautious. "This is Roy," Valerie murmured. "My boyfriend. He helps out sometimes." Roy barely nodded, his expression hard wary. Margaret noticed fresh scratches on his hand knuckles, raw, partially hidden beneath his sleeve. "You see something out by the Briggs room that night?" Margaret asked evenly, watching Roy's reaction closely. Roy stiffened. "No, didn't see nothing. I wasn't even here." Valerie's eyes flickered nervously toward him again, tension rippling visibly across her face. Margaret made careful notes, quietly filing away details: Roy's hostility, Valerie's obvious discomfort. Something was off. The silence grew heavy as she stepped out into the parking lot, noticing how Roy watched through the grimy motel window, his dark eyes coldly following her movements. Returning to her cruiser, Margaret felt unease clawing at the edges of her mind. The Briggs had been scared of someone close by, someone watching. Roy had motive opportunity, and Valerie's nervousness suggested secrets buried deeper still. But as Margaret glanced back once more, catching Roy's silhouette stark against the window, she failed to see the quiet figure across the street, standing motionless near a parked truck, absently rubbing the stump of a missing finger, eyes distant, thoughtful, and oddly patient. 7 years passed, swallowing the Briggs mystery into cold case obscurity. The once vivid urgency faded beneath layers of dead-end tips, forgotten interviews, and exhausted search parties. Red Willow settled back into uneasy normalcy until one bleak March morning in 1990, when everything changed. A logger named Dan Wilkes was clearing a new path deep in the heart of the forest, chainsaw roaring through thick layers of damp wood and moss. Exhausted, he paused, stretching his back, breath misting the chilly air. That's when he noticed it, a strange angular shape half hidden behind tangled brambles, as though the woods had finally surrendered their dark secret. Approaching cautiously, Dan pushed aside branches, revealing a small, ramshackle cabin, weathered wood blending seamlessly into surrounding shadows. The cabin seemed impossibly old, its presence almost dreamlike, but the heavy padlock on the door gleamed strangely new. With uneasy curiosity, Dan circled the structure, his breath quickening. A single boarded-up window hid the interior, but a small gap between the planks revealed fragments of darkness beyond. Pulling the boards away, a heavy, sour smell flooded his senses, mingled with something metallic blood. Inside, dim light filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating an unsettling scene. Small stained clothes lay scattered across a filthy mattress, frayed sleeves, and torn fabric darkened by long-dried blood. Beside the bed sat neatly stacked journals, their faded covers marked by dirt and fingerprints as though handled repeatedly over the years. On the cabin's far wall, roughly carved letters stood out starkly. "He said we must obey." Dan stumbled backward, heart hammering, his mind screaming to flee, but something held him rooted in place. He grabbed one journal, flipping rapidly through brittle pages. Childish handwriting filled every line, growing shakier over time, each entry more desperate, more afraid. The final page contained only a crude drawing, a tall man featureless except for a prominent missing finger. The sketch's simplicity sent chills racing down Dan's spine. Minutes later, Sheriff Margaret Lane stood beside him, staring grimly into the tiny cabin, memories of the Briggs family flooding back. A wave of bitter regret twisted in her gut. They'd missed something crucial all those years ago. As crime scene units meticulously gathered evidence, Margaret's gaze kept returning to the crude drawing. A missing finger. She knew every suspect from memory: Roy from the motel, the bitter relative, the reclusive survivalist, but none matched this detail. Somewhere hidden in plain sight lurked the true face of evil patient, unnoticed, quietly continuing to exist among them. Margaret realized with painful certainty that the real investigation was only beginning. With the rediscovery of the hidden cabin, Sheriff Margaret Lane reopened the Briggs investigation, pushing aside dust-covered boxes of old evidence and resurrecting long-buried fears. Attention swiftly focused on a name once whispered by nervous locals: Eli Carson, the violent and unpredictable survivalist who haunted the forest's darkest edges. Margaret stood on Eli's doorstep, a crude shack made from salvaged wood and rusted metal. It sat deep within a twisted clearing, the land littered with traps and hidden snares. The air smelled of damp earth, animal pelts, and smoke from a low-burning fire. As Margaret approached cautiously, Eli emerged from inside, his lean body, tensed eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You again," he growled softly. His voice held quiet menace barely contained. "Found a cabin, Eli. Deep in the woods. Looked like someone kept prisoners." Margaret paused, deliberately, eyes fixed on his reaction. "Children's clothes, journals, blood." Eli shifted uneasily, fists clenched tight at his sides. "Ain't me. Told you 7 years ago. Told you every time you asked. Funny how that cabin sits on land you know better than anyone." Margaret's voice stayed calm, clinical. "Why'd you clash with Michael Briggs back then? Witnesses said you threatened him." Eli's breathing quickened, his jaw tightening. "Briggs wanted land, my land. Tried to buy me out, thought I'd scare easy. But I ain't no killer, ain't no monster." Margaret stepped closer, noting how Eli's eyes flicked nervously toward the trees, muscles tensed as if sensing a threat lurking unseen in the forest shadows. "You know anything about a man with a missing finger?" Eli flinched visibly, eyes widening in genuine fear. "Heard stories. Thought he was gone. He watches." "Who?" Eli swallowed hard, voice shaking for the first time. "The woodsman. Quiet, helpful, seems harmless. But things happen around him. People disappear." Margaret's brows knitted, skepticism battling intuition. Eli's terror felt real, primal. "And you never reported him? Never warned anyone?" "Nobody listens to me." Eli whispered, eyes haunted. "You see a wild man in the woods, you think monster. But real monsters ain't wild. They hide right there, friendly faces smiling when you ain't looking." Margaret studied Eli carefully, doubt gnawing at the edges of her certainty. She'd come here expecting hostility, resistance, not fear, not warnings. Eli's eyes held sincerity, a quiet dread that rattled her resolve. As Margaret stepped back toward her cruiser, Eli remained motionless, silhouetted against gathering dusk. He watched her vanish among the trees, feeling the cold gaze of someone else watching him. In turn, someone patient, familiar, missing one finger, silently waiting his turn to speak. Back in Red Willow, Sheriff Margaret Lane couldn't shake Eli's fearful warnings. Still, logic dictated caution. Eli Carson had reason to mislead her. Fear alone proved nothing. Margaret's thoughts shifted to Roy, the surly boyfriend from the Pine Ridge Motel, whose name lingered stubbornly on her list. She returned to the motel late in the afternoon, clouds heavy, the air pregnant with coming rain. Valerie Shaw stood anxiously at the desk, eyes widening briefly as Margaret stepped inside. Roy, around Margaret, asked quietly, noting the woman's immediate tension. "Out back," Valerie replied, voice barely audible, glancing nervously toward the rear door. Her eyes held silent warnings. Outside, Roy stood near a rusted tool shed, sorting tools with deliberate, restless movements. Margaret approached slowly, noting how Roy's muscles tensed beneath his shirt fingers gripping tightly around a worn hammer. "Need a few words," Margaret said calmly, standing just beyond his reach. Roy turned slowly, eyes dark, unreadable. "Thought we covered everything years ago. New things came up. Cabin in the woods. Blood journals." Margaret's voice hardened slightly. "You still claim you were nowhere near the Briggs family that night?" Roy's jaw tightened, knuckles whitening around the hammer. "I wasn't involved. Valerie already told you." "But Valerie looked scared." "She afraid of you, Roy." Roy stepped closer, looming slightly menace, flickering beneath carefully restrained anger. "Ask her yourself. But don't come accusing me again unless you've got something real." Margaret noticed his injured hand again, half hidden beneath dirty bandages, fresh blood seeping slightly through. Her voice remained even clinical. "How'd you hurt your hand?" Roy stared silently, finally answering through gritted teeth. "Work accident. Slipped with a knife." Margaret held his gaze, detecting something false behind his practiced calm. Roy was hiding something, but was it connected to the Briggs case or another buried darkness? As Margaret walked away, Valerie caught her eye from the office window, silently beckoning. Margaret followed her inside, closing the door carefully behind them. Roy didn't slip. Valerie whispered hurriedly, words tumbling out in desperation. "He was out in the woods last night, came back bleeding, shaking, wouldn't tell me what happened." Margaret's pulse quickened, slightly urgency threading her voice. "You think Roy hurt someone I don't know," Valerie breathed, eyes wide with fear. "But I saw him watching the Briggs family years ago. He always watched people, especially women." Margaret felt certainty crystallizing, suspicion tightening around Roy like a noose. She thanked Valerie quietly, stepping outside as rain began to fall softly, cold droplets mixing with rising anxiety. Yet as Margaret drove away, her rear-view mirror reflected something she failed to notice: Valerie Shaw standing frozen at the motel's window. Shoulders trembling, eyes slowly shifting to the back room where a quiet figure emerged, watching silently, absently rubbing a scarred, fingerless stump with calm, patient amusement. The rain intensified, blanketing Red Willow in sheets of gray. Margaret drove toward town, thoughts tangled in uncertainty. Roy's suspicious injuries, Valerie's frightened whispers, Eli's dark warnings, all threads pulling in conflicting directions. But another suspect lingered quietly in her notes, overlooked for too long: Jonathan Briggs, Michael's estranged younger brother. Jonathan lived in a modest home near the edge of town, isolated behind overgrown hedges and faded wooden fences. Margaret parked her cruiser outside, sensing eyes behind parted curtains, wary, expectant. Jonathan opened the door cautiously, thin face, drawn tight, age prematurely by stress and bitterness. He studied Margaret quietly, suspicion flickering briefly before vanishing beneath practiced politeness. "Sheriff Lane," Jonathan said flatly, stepping aside. "Come in." Margaret entered slowly, eyes scanning the cramped living room. Faded photos of Michael Briggs and his family sat framed atop a dusty mantelpiece, untouched for years. The air was stale, faintly sour, thick with the scent of old papers and neglect. "You must know why I'm here." Margaret began, gently observing Jonathan carefully. "We found new evidence. Someone kept Michael's family prisoner in the woods." Jonathan's eyes briefly closed, pain flickering behind his controlled expression. "I heard. It wasn't me. I've already lost everything." Margaret softened her voice, pressing gently. "People said you argued with Michael about money inheritance, said you resented him." Jonathan's jaw clenched slightly, bitterness rising unbidden. "Michael got everything. Father always favored him. I was angry, yes, but I wouldn't hurt them, especially the children." Margaret quietly moved closer, noting Jonathan's nervous habit of twisting the gold ring on his finger, eyes avoiding hers. "Where were you that weekend, Jonathan?" "Back in 1983, home. Alone." Jonathan's voice weakened, aware how inadequate his answer sounded. "I was always alone after our father passed. Michael didn't want me around. He called me irresponsible, a failure. That's the last we ever spoke." Margaret studied Jonathan's strained expression, sensing genuine grief beneath lingering resentment. But family betrayal often concealed darker impulses. "Do you recognize this?" She unfolded a copy of the crude sketch from the cabin showing the man with the missing finger. Jonathan's face paled, voice barely audible. "No. Should I?" Margaret felt instinct pressing harder, frustration mounting. Jonathan seemed plausible, troubled enough for violence. Yet his confusion, his quiet sadness, tugged against suspicion. As she left Jonathan's home, rain splashing heavily on her windshield, Margaret hesitated briefly, wondering if she'd overlooked something vital again. In her rearview mirror, Jonathan stood motionless in his doorway, shoulders slumped beneath invisible weight. But Margaret failed to notice the figure hidden in shadow across the street, watching silently, patiently, as always, carefully tucking away a small, faded photograph of the Briggs children into a weathered jacket pocket, the missing finger leaving behind only a smudged trace against the brittle paper. As dusk settled, Margaret returned to her dimly lit office, rain tapping rhythmically against the windows. Files sprawled across her desk, old photographs of suspects arranged in an unsettling mosaic. She'd been meticulous, yet every path circled back to uncertainty, every suspect trailing off into shadows. Her eyes lingered on the crude sketch, the figure without a finger. That small detail refused to fade from her thoughts, gnawing at her intuition. No known suspect matched that physical trait. She stared at the drawing until her vision blurred, frustration edging toward exhaustion. The phone broke her concentration, sharply ringing harshly into the stillness. Margaret answered, startled by Valerie Shaw's panicked voice. "Sheriff, you need to come back. Roy found out I talked to you. He's gone. Left angry, said he was going to settle things." "Where?" Margaret demanded sharply. "I don't know," Valerie breathed, voice shaking. "But I found something he hid in the shed. It belongs to the Briggs boy, a small backpack." Margaret's pulse quickened. Roy was spiraling, dangerous, perhaps desperate enough to finally reveal his guilt. She sped back through the rain tires, sliding on slick roads, heart pounding with urgent clarity. Arriving at the motel, Margaret hurried toward the shed behind Valerie. Inside, amid shadows and rusted tools, lay the faded backpack. Margaret knelt carefully, lifting the zipper, breath catching painfully. Inside rested a small notebook, worn and stained, Tommy Briggs's handwriting, pages filled with fearful words, fragments of quiet despair. Yet something felt off. Margaret stood slowly, realization dawning. "Valerie, how did you know this belonged to Tommy?" Valerie hesitated briefly, eyes widening in fear, quickly covering the slip. I remember it from the news reports." Margaret studied her carefully, suspicion rising, tangled with confusion. But before she could press further, her radio crackled urgently, a deputy calling from the lodge. "Sheriff, there's trouble here. Roy's at the lodge. Armed, yelling about injustice, says we got it all wrong." Margaret moved swiftly, telling Valerie to stay put as she raced toward the lodge, anxiety pressing tight against her chest. Headlights illuminated towering trees, flashing past shadows, looming ominously in her peripheral vision. She arrived to chaos, Roy pacing near the lodge porch, rifle gripped tightly, eyes wild. He shouted desperately, voice breaking, "I found the backpack. Someone planted it. I'm being set up." Margaret approached slowly, palms open, voice calm yet commanding. Roy put it down. "We can talk." Roy's eyes darted frantically, panic surging visibly. "It's him. It's always been him. You just never looked. You never." His voice cut off sharply, gaze fixed somewhere beyond Margaret. She turned instinctively, glimpsing a figure standing quietly among the trees, hidden by shadows, calmly watching. Then the shape withdrew silently, leaving behind only darkness and the faint glint of something metallic. A simple ring glistening briefly in the rain. Roy surrendered without resistance, his desperate pleas echoing in Margaret's ears as deputies took him away. But the panic in his eyes haunted her, something genuine behind his frightened warnings. Margaret lingered alone at the lodge, rain-soaked, staring into the darkness where the silent figure had vanished. A sudden memory emerged, a forgotten piece buried within old case files. There had been another presence at the lodge back in 1983, a handyman quietly dismissed just weeks after the Briggs family disappeared. No fuss, no attention, just quiet departure. Margaret retrieved the name from faded papers, Henry Dillard. She returned to the station, pulling Dillard's sparse records. The man was a ghost, drifting quietly from town to town, never staying long, never drawing suspicion. But Margaret's eyes froze on one chilling detail, a medical report from a logging accident. Decades earlier, Henry Dillard had lost his right index finger. Cold realization flooded through her pieces, snapping into place. The sketch, the missing finger, quiet patience hidden behind helpful smiles. It fit perfectly. Margaret felt her stomach churn. They'd overlooked him entirely. Urgently, she drove through rain-slicked streets toward Dillard's last known address, a small cabin near the edge of town obscured by tall pines. Margaret approached slowly, heart-racing flashlights slicing through curtains of rain. The cabin sat dark, silent door slightly ajar as if awaiting her arrival. Inside air, thick with mildew and stale dust. Furniture sparse, tidy, oddly meticulous. Margaret's beam illuminated carefully arranged objects, an old carving knife, coils of rope, neatly stacked cans of food. Then a faded photograph pinned to the wall halted her breath. A candid shot of the Briggs family smiling warmly, unaware they were being watched. Floorboards creaked suddenly behind her. Margaret spun flashlight beam, shaking slightly. Standing quietly in the doorway was Henry Dillard, calmly watching, face expressionless, except for gentle curiosity. "You finally remembered me, Sheriff," he murmured softly, stepping forward with slow, deliberate ease. Margaret steadied her voice, feeling vulnerable in his quiet presence. "What did you do to them, Henry?" He smiled faintly, almost regretfully. "I gave them peace. They fought at first, of course, but they learned obedience. Eventually, they accepted it. Until they didn't." "Where are they?" Margaret demanded, forcing authority back into her voice. His eyes drifted toward the darkness beyond the window, voice barely audible. "The woods keep secrets better than people. They're part of it now." Margaret reached for her radio, but Dillard moved suddenly, deceptively fast. Before she could react, a blunt pain exploded across her skull, vision swimming darkness rushing forward to claim her. As she fell, Dillard stood patiently, fingers calmly wiping droplets of rain from his sleeve. The missing finger's stump prominent in the pale moonlight. Softly, gently, he whispered to Margaret's unconscious form, "Now you'll understand." Margaret awoke slowly, consciousness returning in waves of disorientation. Her head throbbed fiercely, a dull ache pulsing beneath blood-matted hair. Cold seeped into her skin from rough wooden planks beneath her, the air heavy with the familiar metallic scent of rust and old blood. She lay still, forcing her breathing steady, fighting panic as she took in her surroundings. Dim lantern light flickered unevenly across familiar stained walls, the hidden cabin deep within the woods. It had become her prison just as it once held the Briggs family. Chains rattled softly as Margaret moved, wrists bound tightly behind her back, skin chafed raw. Her heart quickened as memories returned, Henry Dillard's calm, patient eyes, the missing finger, his quiet confession. The true monster had been hiding all along, unnoticed helping hands masking violent intent. From the shadows, Dillard emerged, placing an old wooden chair beside her. He sat casually, leaning forward, his gaze gentle, almost sympathetic. You wonder why he murmured softly, as though reading her thoughts. "But it's simple. People are flawed, imperfect, ungrateful. They ruin everything, unless someone shows them how to obey." Margaret forced defiance into her voice despite her fear. "You imprisoned an innocent family, you hurt children." Dillard's face twitched slightly, a flicker of genuine regret briefly visible. "Necessary lessons, Sheriff. They learned, for a while." He stood slowly, pacing toward a small wooden trunk, removing a bundle wrapped carefully in faded cloth. Margaret's stomach twisted, anticipating horror, as he gently unwrapped a child's shoe worn and stained. They tried escaping eventually. Couldn't accept their fate. So, I freed them another way. His voice remained soft, detached, clinical in its chilling precision. Margaret shivered uncontrollably, nausea rising sharply. Footsteps sounded suddenly outside, urgent, approaching rapidly. Dillard stiffened briefly, then smiled faintly, calmly, retrieving a rusted hunting knife from the table. "Looks like we have company," Margaret screamed, voice raw, desperate. The cabin door burst open violently, deputies storming inside, guns drawn. Dillard stood utterly calm, expression neutral, knife hanging loosely at his side. "Drop it, Henry," a deputy shouted. Dillard merely smiled, stepping forward slowly, deliberately toward the raised weapons. The gunshot cracked sharply, echoing painfully within the confined space. Dillard's staggered slightly smile, never fading, collapsing gently to his knees. Margaret watched breath-ragged chains rattling as deputies rushed toward her, but her eyes remained fixed on Dillard as life drained quietly from him. Even as death approached, his expression stayed peaceful, patient. His secret purpose fulfilled the darkness he'd carefully nurtured, finally unmasked. Yet Margaret knew this cabin would forever hold the echoes of his whispered lessons, a haunting reminder that true evil could quietly thrive behind the most unassuming faces. Weeks passed, but Margaret Lane couldn't escape the nightmare. Every shadow held echoes of Henry Dillard's calm voice, each silence heavy with memories of the hidden cabin's horror. Red Willow struggled to heal, yet wounds of betrayal ran deep, distrust festering quietly beneath surface normality. The FBI had uncovered human remains buried in shallow graves behind Dillard's cabin. Michael, Emma, Sarah, and Tommy Briggs. Their stories finally laid bare in careful clinical reports. Margaret forced herself to read every detail, a grim duty she owed their memories. Yet nothing prepared her for the quiet dread lingering behind Dillard's meticulously kept journals. Within their pages, she glimpsed fragments of a disturbed yet painfully coherent mind, calm notes about obedience lessons taught through isolation and fear, punctuated with chilling tenderness. Margaret understood now. Henry had believed he was protecting them, correcting the world's chaos through absolute control. His motives were twisted but frighteningly logical, cloaked in gentle intentions, masking cruelty. Late one evening, she returned alone to the lodge, driven by a compulsion she couldn't deny. The air was cold, dense fog clinging to towering pines as Margaret stood silently near the porch where she'd first confronted Roy. She felt eyes upon her, imagined or real, haunting her every step. Inside rooms sat untouched furniture, blanketed with years of dust. Margaret's flashlight swept across faded photographs. Old toys left scattered whispers of innocent lives, abruptly ended. Her breath caught painfully. She hadn't realized until now how deeply their story had intertwined with her own. Footsteps echoed suddenly behind her, calm, deliberate. Margaret spun, heart pounding violently, as Valerie Shaw emerged from shadow, standing quietly in the doorway. "Valerie." Margaret whispered sharply, "What are you doing here?" Valerie smiled softly, stepping closer, voice gentle yet strangely detached. "Checking on things. Henry always said it was important to finish what we start." Margaret's skin prickled sharply, dread rising. "You knew Henry?" Valerie nodded slowly, eyes distant, nostalgic. "He raised me, took me from a bad place, taught me discipline, obedience. But I disappointed him, made mistakes." Margaret's pulse thundered, disbelief colliding sharply with reality. Valerie's nervousness at the motel, her quiet manipulation, small details now starkly illuminated in terrifying clarity. "You planted the backpack," Margaret breathed in horror. "You framed Roy." Valerie smiled again, sadder this time. "He was convenient. But Henry, he was always patient, methodical. He knew one day someone would understand. Someone worthy." Margaret moved back slowly, calculating distance to the door. Valerie stepped forward, calm eyes flickering briefly with intensity, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It was always about obedience, Sheriff. Henry left unfinished business lessons yet to teach." Valerie's hand slid calmly into her pocket, revealing a small, gleaming blade identical to Henry's, a quiet promise of pain hidden patiently until this very moment. Margaret stared at Valerie, breath held tight, pulse thundering in her ears. Valerie stepped forward slowly, eyes never wavering, blade reflecting softly in the dim glow of Margaret's flashlight. Silence pressed heavily upon them, thick with decades of buried secrets. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said carefully, voice steady despite fear tightening her throat. Valerie hesitated briefly, pain flickering behind calm resolve. "Henry was right about people. We only learn through suffering. You learned, Sheriff, just like I did." Margaret held Valerie's gaze, compassion mingling with terror. "You were a victim, Valerie, but you have a choice now. Henry doesn't control you, not anymore." Valerie's grip tightened briefly, conflict shadowing her features. Memories flickered behind her eyes, years of quiet obedience battling against fragile hope. He saved me once, she whispered softly, almost pleading. But he took everything else. Margaret reached out cautiously, voice gentle yet firm. Then end it now. You don't have to be him. Not anymore. Valerie trembled visibly, blade slipping slightly from shaking fingers, tears pooling silently. Margaret moved carefully closer, taking Valerie's hand in her own, feeling the coldness, the brittle fear of someone long trapped in darkness. Slowly, Valerie released the knife metal, clattering to the floor, echoing sharply through the lodge. She collapsed softly, sobbing openly, shoulders shaking beneath Margaret's reassuring touch. As deputies arrived minutes later, Valerie surrendered without resistance, eyes hollow, yet somehow free. Margaret stood silently watching her leave, knowing Valerie carried shadows that would linger forever, but she had taken a step toward something better. Later, standing outside in crisp evening air, Margaret watched as dawn broke softly over Red Willow, painting the forest in gentle shades of gold and rose. She understood now how easily evil could wear familiar faces hidden behind kindness and trust. Yet hope, fragile as it was, had survived. As they cleared the lodge, Margaret looked at the cabin one last time. The real journey was just beginning. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces, but compassion endures. As she moved toward her new future, Margaret squeezed Deputy Hendrix's hand. "Will it ever feel safe again?" she asked softly, voice trembling slightly with lingering fear. Hendrix squeezed gently in return. "We'll make sure it does." They stepped together toward healing, toward a future they would build one cautious, hopeful day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.